Disney, I'd like to welcome all ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. What you see is the official title for my presentation, but this is the real title of my presentation. A couple of things before I start. I'm going to go into a little detail on parts of a Winchester, functioning of a Winchester, which is old hat to 99% of you in here, so I'm not doubting your ability to understand what I'm talking about. But I want to make sure that those that aren't familiar with the intricacies of the Winchester can understand and appreciate what I'm talking about. Like most of you, I'm a big fan of Westerns. Grew up with TV and movies from the 50s and on. At the time, I was not knowledgeable about Winchesters. I knew what a Winchester was, but I didn't have any really knowledge of the models and the intricacies of Winchesters. But about 20 years ago, I started collecting guns of the Old West, to include, of course, Winchesters. So my knowledge became more understanding the models and all that. When I first saw Hombre in 1967, I was 20 years old. Thought it was a great film. Something about the rifle, even though I knew nothing about Winchesters, caught my eye subliminally. Something about it was cool. A few years ago, when I saw Hombre again, now with an understanding of Winchesters, I looked at the rifle and I said, that's an 1873. You don't normally see that in TV Westerns and movie Westerns of the period. Plus it had a button magazine. That also to me was very odd to see in movies of the period. Why was the 73 Winchester rare to see? Because as you all know, everybody carried 1892 Winchesters, which was totally wrong for the period. In fact, in Hombre, the main character, Newman's character, carries 1892 Winchesters. Well, why didn't they just give Paul Newman an 1892 Winchester? No one would have cared. That got my interest up. Why did they pick that particular rifle for Paul Newman? I went online. Nobody really knew. But something else happened. Here's the first appearance of the Hombre Winchester in the film, early on. Okay, that's a nice, shiny button magazine, 1873. That alone piqued my interest. But there was something additional that really piqued my interest. I'm sorry, go ahead. Something looks like it's protruding below the tube magazine. What is that? That doesn't look like any Winchester I've ever seen before. So that made me wonder, what is that? And started my quest to find out about the Hombre Winchester. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of people online and in forums thought it was in 1876, and I'm not really sure why. And as most of you know, Here's an 1873. Here's an 1876 up at top. You'll notice that the 1873, the rear of the side plate is pointed. 1876, the end or the rear of the side plate is rounded. Well, there's an easy way to tell. So that I thought was interesting that people didn't know that difference. Luckily, I went online and went to Facebook. Just by chance, I typed in, I don't remember what it was, the rifle used by Paul Newman or Western guns, and by chance I came across a Facebook page by a gentleman named Peter Sherayko. Don't tell Peter this, but I didn't know who Peter Sherayko was. But I soon learned, by the way, he had written a book, Tombstone, the Guns and Gear, and had not only had he appeared in the movie as Texas Jack Vermillion on the far right, but he had also provided the props, the rifles, the guns, the saddles, all the equipment to make this movie one of the first to accurately portray what Western equipment looked like in the period. Much different than early Hollywood films. Now we all know, or most of us know, that Peter has a company called Caravan West, and the purpose of his company is to make accurate Westerns, period correct Westerns. Not only the gear, but he also provides extras called buckaroos, who act as extras, who know how to ride and know how to shoot and make Westerns realistic. Caravan West is in Agua Dulce, California, which is about 45 miles north of LA. In addition to the Tombstone book, Peter also has another book called The Fringe of Hollywood. And that book is devoted to educating whoever reads it on how Hollywood has gotten Westerns wrong for years and years and years. And here's why, and here's how saddles should be, here's how scarves should be, here's how bandanas should be, here's how hats should be. And it's a very educational book. And by the way, this is the third time I've plugged Peter, so Peter, you know where to send the check. I contacted Peter through Facebook and said I was interested in writing an article in Winchester Collector magazine about the Hombre Winchester. I thought it would be interesting. I asked him if I could come visit him. He graciously said yes. So I flew to Agua Dulce and went to his 3,000-acre ranch in the beautiful horse country of California. Two incredibly wonderful first impressions occurred on this visit. The first was, I was a little lost, and I called him and said, I think I'm in the wrong driveway, can you give me some guidance? And he said, I'll be standing in the driveway. Well, I pulled into the correct driveway, and there standing is a bigger-than-life character that I would call a living Buffalo Bill. I don't have a picture of him standing in the driveway, but after meeting him and shaking his hand, he invited me into his library. There's the Peter that we all know. His library, by the way, is just filled with hundreds and hundreds of incredibly educational books on Indians, the Old West, costumes, and all that. Now, being very honest, and Peter's never heard this before, of course I formed 3,000 miles because I wanted to see the Hombre Winchester. This was the goal of my life. But something in the back of my head said, I'm not going to be a pain in the ass. I'm going to get acquainted with Peter, and I'm going to be respectful, and it's the best thing I ever did. I sat down with Peter in his library. He told me about his life. We shared great times and had a wonderful, wonderful experience, and I don't regret it. It was wonderful. And then he said, would you like a tour? I'm thinking, boy, I want to to see that rifle, but yes, I want a tour. And it was amazing. He has buildings for saddles. He has buildings for guns. He has buildings for hats. He has buildings for holsters. He has a giant building of all kinds of props for Hollywood films. It was an amazing experience. Well, after we did that, he said, well, let's go to the firearms room. Big smile on my face. So we go to this rather large building, and he opens the door, and I've never seen anything like it in my life. It was wall-to-wall ceiling, firearms, just an amazing experience. So he took me around all of the firearms and showed me all the things he had. And then finally he said, well, you probably want to see the Hombre Winchester now. And I said, sure. So he reaches down and he's got a wall with about 50 or 75, 1873, some antique, some Italian replicas. And he reaches down, he picks one out from the side, and he hands it to me, and I look at it, and we go outside because you can see better. And I've never told Peter this before, but my vision of the Hombre Winchester was when we first opened it was nice and shiny, and it was wonderful looking. And I looked at this rifle, and it was anything but. It was rusty, not terribly rusty, some surface rust. It was dusty and dirty, and it had all kinds of damage and weird things, which I'll go into more detail. Now, in all fairness to Peter, I'm looking for the shiny holy grail. Peter's in Hollywood films. He could care less that Paul Newman uses in a major motion picture. It's a prop. And as a prop, he uses it as any prop is. The good news is, stamped on the bottom of the receiver's 20th Fox. That's good. That tells me that this really might be the Hombre Winchester. But let's go into detail of what I first saw. Let's start with the front sight. Instead of a standard dovetailed front sight, is a piece of scrap metal that has been silver soldered to the barrel. Now I'll explain why this was done in just a second. For those of you who don't know, this is what the front sight of a Winchester should look like. There should be a dovetail where the front sight is positioned. But this barrel had been shortened by a little over 4 inches, and that dovetail is no longer there. So the Hollywood armorer probably just took a piece of scrap metal, silver soldered it to the top. Who's going to really know, who's going to care in a Hollywood film, Hollywood Western? Moving down to where the wooden forend is a metal piece called a end cap or end tip. And the end tip has been welded to the barrel. Why was that done? I'll get to that in a second. Where a screw is to normally hold the end cap in place, it's been silver soldered in place. It's not really being used as a normal screw. Moving farther to the rear, where the barrel meets the end of the forend behind the sight, you'll notice a series of tool marks, probably for some kind of vise that was used to do some work on the barrel. And on the top of the receiver are more tool marks. And interestingly enough, notice that the proof mark on the receiver is out of line with the proof mark on the barrel, showing that the barrel is actually tilted 10 or 20 degrees off center. Going over to the other side, you'll notice that the end tip is also welded to the barrel. And once again, the screw that normally is used to hold it in place has been silver soldered over. Also, there's a big chip in the fore end. Now we go to the bottom. The magazine tube has been welded to the end tip. And very importantly, you'll notice an exposed dovetail under the barrel and a groove that extends the full length of the barrel. This suggests that the rifle was originally a full-length barrel with a full-length magazine tube. Now, what is the purpose of the dovetail for those of you who might not know it? The dovetail has a piece called a fore-end tip tenon, which goes into the dovetail. The fore-end tip fits over that piece and secures the fore-end, and the two screws hold it in place. Well, moving along to the fore-end bottom, you can see a big crack that goes all the way from the receiver to the muzzle end. To me, that suggested that sometime in its life, the fore-end received damage and the front of the fore-end was missing. So in order for the fore-end to be attached and secured to the barrel, they welded it in place. There's more. The trigger has two countersunk holes in it. Why? I have a theory about that coming up later. By the way, I have some theories and some assumptions because there's still things that I'll never know because Peter Newman is no longer with us, the armor is no longer with us, the director is no longer with us, and 20th Century Fox could care less when I ask them questions about stuff. Moving to the front, you'll notice that the magazine tube plug, the slot is positioned parallel to the barrel. Correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen and ladies. All end plugs that leave the factory are perpendicular to the barrel. Again on the bottom, behind the lever is the lever latch. It's missing. Notice the hole where the lever latch should be. What is a lever latch? The lever latch is a rotating device that holds the lever in place when the rifle's not being used to keep the rifle in battery, because if the lever moves down, it can cause ejection of the cartridge or other issues, so the lever latch secures the lever. This is the butt plate of the Hombre Winchester. Why is this unusual for an 1873 Winchester in .44-40 caliber? Because it should have a trapdoor in the rear to accommodate a take-apart cleaning rod. The bottom line was, and I've never told Peter this before, but I'm telling him now because he's in the audience, is I respected Peter. He said this was the Hombre Winchester, but my concern was, naively, if I write an article about this in Winchester magazine, and it turns out that it's not the Hombre Winchester, and somebody objects and complains, well, Peter's reputation is at stake, my reputation is at stake, and the Winchester Arms Collector magazine's reputation is at stake. So I was concerned. What am I going to do? being said, the next thing Peter did, and I didn't mention any of this to him, because I respect him, I didn't want to insult him in any way, shape, or form. He made me feel better because he said, "Would you like to shoot it?" I said yes. Cowboy action loads, not black cowboy. Hey, Judy had a rock about 75 yards away on this 3,000-acre ranch. I had to change my underwear after that. Sorry. So, I fly back home. And needless to say, I was nerve-wracked. What am I going to do? How am I going to solve this dilemma? Why would they give this kind of a rifle to a major motion picture star in a major motion picture? It didn't make logical sense to me. So I had a brainstorm. They came out with a high-resolution Blu-ray DVD of Hombre. I bought it. I had a computer-savvy friend, and he converted it to a video file. And then we portrayed it onto, or projected it onto a large screen monitor where we could freeze frame it. And here are the results. Here on the top is the rifle as I first saw it. Here on the bottom is a frame from the film. You be the judge. Let's start with the scrap metal front sight. Now it's hard to see on the bottom, but I have a better picture of it. How about that unique, and there's that little ding. There's a little ding behind the front sight. There's the ding on the barrel. There's that unique weld mark. There's that unique weld mark. Also behind, or in front of the rear sight is another little ding. There's that little ding. Remember I said I have a better picture of the front sight? Let's compare that with the picture of the front sight of the movie. Not only can you see the square shape, but you can see the ridge on both of those. Let's move on to those tool marks. Now this might be hard to see on the screen because it's very hard to always get the vantage that I wanted in the film. There are the tool marks on the real rifle, and there are the tool marks on the movie rifle. Moving over to the other side, there's another unique weld mark. Let's compare that to the movie rifle. There's the weld mark. To me, it looks like the state of Maine, I call it. There's that same weld mark on the rifle. Remember that there's a missing fore-end piece that I noted earlier. There's that missing fore-end piece. Moving to the bottom, there's a missing lever latch. And there is the exposed dovetail, the channel for the tubular magazine, and the weld mark that's holding the magazine tube on the fore-end tip. Well, luckily, Paul Newman, after shooting a bad guy on top of the mud wagon or stagecoach, puts the rifle down for a little bit. Let's compare the missing lever latch. The weld mark, the exposed dovetail, and the channel for the original full-length tubular magazine, which brings up a revelation. Remember, what started my quest and intrigued me was that little thing that was visible below the tube magazine. What was that? Well, it's the weld for the tube magazine reflecting light. Remember that the bottom of the wooden forend, is cracked all the way. But not only that, there's a distinct shape along the crack. On the bottom is a picture of Paul Newman holding a rifle in the same position. And you can see that unique that unique crack mark. True or false? It's all there. Well, how about the holes in the trigger? Here's Paul Newman holding the rifle, and you can see one of the holes on the bottom, his fingers covering up the second hole. Now, I said I had a theory as to what these holes are for. I will discuss that shortly. Moving to the front, remember I said that the end plug on the tube magazine is positioned parallel instead of perpendicular. Here's a close-up of the rifle in the movie, and you can clearly see that the end plug is positioned parallel. Any doubts that this is the Hombre Winchester? Thank you. Now that I had the proof and warm feeling in my tummy, I felt comfortable enough to ask Peter if I could display it at gun shows. This is about 2016. The first one was the big Reno show. Peter was gracious enough to come to the show and bring the rifle for me to display. This is my first display, which is quite a beginning, but a good place to start. And if you look to the far right, you can see Peter sitting with his back to me because he's got his own tray table at the show. Another thing I did to enhance my display, which has been a continuing process, was to get a factory letter. And as the factory letter shows, it was in fact a full-length round barrel, which is in keeping with the channel for the tubular magazine and other things about the rifle. Well, I displayed the rifle at different gun shows and events, and every time Peter was gracious enough to provide the rifle for me to display. At the Cowboy Con show in Reno, which was an interesting experience, I decided to talk to Peter to see if he might be interested in selling me the rifle. I had heard other people ask him, what do you want for the rifle? And he'd come up with a price. And I thought that was a little bit too rich for my blood, but I thought I might be able to negotiate with him. So I sat down with him and I said, here's my proposal. I would also provide a similar looking Winchester rifle, 1873, to replace the one that you might give up to me. But the most important thing I said was, a lot of people would get this rifle and then resell it and make more money off it. And I promised him, I gave him my word that I would not do that. And as proof, the rifle is in my will to go to the Cody Firearms Museum. So, we negotiated. He made my impossible dream come true. And needless to say, when the rifle was shipped to me FedEx, I was a nervous wreck until it showed up at my doorstep. Now that I had the rifle in my possession, the first thing I did was clean it. Remember, it had dust, it had some surface rust. Now, you collectors would say, oh no, you never want to clean, da 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 da. This was not a collectible rifle, pristine, that's worth a lot of money to a collector. As a matter of fact, I propose to you, gentlemen and ladies that collect, if I walked into the gun show today and you had no idea that this was the Hombre Winchester, in the condition it's in, what would you offer me for it? Probably nothing, if not much, because it's a beat-up rifle. So after cleaning it, I noticed something I'd never noticed before. Above the receiver were what I thought were the initials JWL. Who's JWL? I contacted Peter. I sent him a picture of it, actually. I said, have you seen this before? He told me. It's 5-in-1. The armorer for 20th Century Fox had scratched 5-in-1 on top of the receiver so that everybody knew that this rifle accepted the 5-in-1 blank that's compatible with 3 revolvers and 2 rifles commonly used in Hollywood films at the time, 5-in-1. Another thing I did now that I had the rifle in my possession was I suspected that the buttstock didn't look right to me. So I took it off and I compared it with a proper buttstock from an 1873 Winchester that I own. And you can see from these photos, there are indeed some differences. First of all, the lengths are different. The shape and position of the comb is different. And most notably, it's my understanding that all 1873 Winchester buttstocks had the hole in the buttstock for the cleaning rod. You'll notice that Hombre does not. This implied that the buttstock was not a Winchester buttstock. On the Winchester forum recently, I was able to have more knowledgeable people than I, when I said close-ups of the workings of the buttstock, confirmed that it is indeed a manufactured buttstock, not one that comes from a Winchester, maybe something that the special effects people or the people did because something happened to the original one and they wanted to replace it. Something else I did now that I had the rifle. Remember, I got to shoot it a couple of times at Peter's Ranch, but that wasn't good enough for me. Took it to the range with black powder 4440 cartridges with a friend, and at 100 yards, we shot at a steel silhouette target. So here is the Hombre Winchester, 114-year-old rifle, been through hell in Hollywood. Let's see how it does at 100 yards. Hear the ding? And now my friend. Got it. Here's the target. Oh, sorry. Gotta do this differently. Now, there are some discrepancies with this rifle in the movie, and I'm man enough to admit it. So let's discuss those. Was another rifle used in the film? I believe so in at least one important scene. For those of you who are not familiar with the movie, there's one scene in I call it the cantina scene, where Paul Newman's character goes to the defense of his Indian sidekicks who are being harassed by a nasty cowboy. Let's run that discuss it. As Paul Newman walked over to the cowboy, look at the bore of the rifle as he walked over. That bore to me looks a lot larger than it should. It's an assumption based on what I can see. After he strikes the cowboy, look at the dimensions of the bore. It looks like a 4440 rifle should look. Also, the button magazine looks more like a factory button magazine should look. Hombre does not. My theory is, because Paul Newman is going to strike another actor, for safety reasons, it was a prop dummy rubber rifle. It's an assumption. And once he did that, then he has a more regular looking rifle to complete the scene. It's an assumption, but something is definitely different in my opinion. Here's another. Throughout the entire film, every picture of the butt plate has no trapdoor for the cleaning rod. Except one. Now, I'm not able to tell from the rifle if that is the Hombre Winchester with a different butt stock or butt plate or not. I don't know. Is it possible that that started out that way, got broken? I don't know. It's conjecture. On the forum, trying to gain more information, somebody told me about the movie Rio Conchos. I'd never heard the movie Rio Conchos, so I bought the DVD and watched it. Sure enough, there are Winchesters, 1873s, that look very similar to the Hombre Winchester. This movie was made in 1964, 3 years before Hombre. Also has Richard Boone in it, interestingly enough. But here's a freeze frame of one of the rifles by the actor Stuart Whitman. It's hard for you to see, but believe me, it has what appears to be a cut-down barrel. It has a square piece of metal instead of a proper front sight. But if you look closely at the butt magazine, it looks correct for a butt magazine. Then there's further proof that it's not the Hombre Winchester, in my opinion. Richard Boone has two different versions of this rifle. You'll notice that in either version there is no exposed dovetail nor exposed channel for the tube magazine. So in my opinion, none of these rifles are the Hombre Winchester as I know it. Remember my first question was, why did they choose this particular rifle for Paul Newman? I think I have a valid assumption. Hombre was first a novel by Elmore Leonard. Here's the novel, and next to it is the script from the film. Well, let's take a look at each. In the novel, it says that Paul Newman's character had a 56-56 Spencer. His two Indian sidekicks had Springfields, probably Springfield trapdoor carbines. The script says the same. The Indians had Springfields. Newman's character has a Spencer. Well, that says that the rifle that the Indians have is different than the rifle that Newman's character has. So in the spirit of authenticity, they wanted to replicate that. Well, Peter tells me that Springfields were available back then, but Spencer's is a different story. Spencer's back then were antiques that shot a rimfire cartridge, and the way they operated it was you had to, it was a repeater, a 7-shot repeater, but unlike a Winchester, you had to cock the hammer, use the lever to chamber a round or eject one, close the lever, fire it, and then pull the hammer back. Well, that's not at all conducive to the movie. So in the spirit of the movie, they gave the two Indians 1892 Winchesters, and to give Newman's character something different, they picked the Hombre Winchester. That's an assumption. I can never prove it, but I like it. By the way, this is what it looks like in keeping with the novel and in keeping with the script. The top is a Spencer, the bottom is a Springfield trapdoor carbine. Why the holes in the trigger? Here is my assumption, and some people in the forum have stated that they have seen other rifles with similar holes in the trigger. I'm going to show you a scene where Paul Newman's character is atop the mud wagon or stagecoach, and his rifle is hidden in atop the mud wagon, and he's going to rapidly shoot 3 times the bad cowboy who he had the encounter with earlier at the cantina. Now there's a little blood in it, but it's silly Hollywood fake blood, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. Let me explain why I believe the holes are in the trigger. To rapid fire a Winchester rifle, which they do nowadays in cavalry action shooting events, they get a hold of the lever and they position their finger close to the trigger so that when they lift the finger, lift the lever up, it contacts the trigger and fires rapidly. The problem with doing that, if you're not experienced, is the end of the trigger is very sharp. And if you do it improperly, you do what's called harpooning your finger. My assumption is they didn't want Paul Newman harpooning his finger, so they did something to the trigger. They added some kind of an extension, something I haven't figured out how they did it. So all Newman had to do was operate the lever, and by lifting the lever up, it automatically contacted the trigger and fired rapidly. What supports my assumption is that you never see Newman up here doing it. It's hidden because the rifle is laying on top of the stagecoach. You never see what he's doing. My life has been filled with amazing coincidences, and the Hombre Winchester is right up there with them. Let me share with you a few. I have a little 21-foot RV. We go camping in it. It has a TV antenna, nothing fancy, no satellites. Well, if you've ever done anything with a TV antenna, you have to search and find all the available stations, and it takes a while. And then when it finally comes up, you start flipping channels to see what you get. Well, I do that, and I'm flipping the channels, and all of a sudden, I see a Western movie I've never seen before. It shows Indians attacking Custer, but not the Little Bighorn battle, something way before the Little Bighorn battle. And there's a bad Indian agent that's providing weapons to the Indians. And I look, and he's holding this thing that looks a lot like the Hombre Winchester. What are the odds? I had just flipped the channel and there it was. Now, was it the Hombre Winchester? You tell me. There's the exposed dovetail and the channel for the full-length tubular magazine. What this Western was a 1967 20th Century Fox program, first TV, and then they made a movie out of it, Custer, with some gentleman I've never even seen play Custer before. What are the odds? Another coincidence. I was displaying the Hombre Winchester at a local cowboy action shooting in Florida, and a friend of mine comes up to me and he says, "Can you use these?" I couldn't have prayed for somebody to give me something better to add to my display than 5-in-1 blanks. One more coincidence. A few weeks ago, I'm from Miami, Florida, and somebody on Facebook shared with me an 8-minute movie of pictures of Miami in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Buildings, all kinds of things, scenery and all that, to include advertisements from local newspapers. Hombre. What are the odds that of all the movies they could have picked to put in that 8-minute video was Hombre? In addition to the rifle and the things for my display, as you would expect, I've also collected things that add to the value to me of having this wonderful rifle. One is a full-up press kit. Another is a gigantic wall poster from France. Also, there are all kinds of, I think they're called press photos, that show the Hombre Winchester being held by Paul Newman in scenes from the film. And then there's this. How many remember Mad Magazine? Lo and behold, this issue of Mad Magazine had a satire on Hombre called Sombre. I'd like to thank and recognize and thank two people that are very, very important to me for this impossible dream that's come true. First is my wonderful partner, Patty, who has been with me on every single display, helped me set up, helped me tear down. I have to go to the bathroom. She talks to the people, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate what she's done for the success of my display. And then this guy. Peter has been beyond belief helpful, wonderful, and supported me in every way, shape, or form. He's my hero, and I thank him very much. Now, before I go to the final slide, comments and questions, I'm going to answer one question. Remember I said that I wanted to write an article in Winchester magazine about this. Well, why haven't I done it yet? And the answer is very simple. Every time I display this, I learned something new, and I really don't feel like I've answered all the questions yet. So someday I promise I'm going to write that article. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that completes my presentation. Are there any questions or comments?
How did the rifle get out of the prop house into Peter's hands?
The question was, how did the rifle get out of the prop house in Peter's hands? Peter, should I tell him you stole it, or should I just lie? Peter bought the rifle on auction from 20th Century Fox in the 1980s. My understanding is that 20th Century Fox had their own armory, but they got tired of dealing with California gun laws. So they decided to auction off the guns and let someone like Stonebridge handle the responsibility. So Peter auctioned and won a group of guns for his business, and the Hombre Winchester was one of them. It was not advertised, it was not listed, it was just a prop to 20th Century Fox. Only when he took it home and he examined it did he realize it was the Hombre Winchester. That's how Peter acquired it. Now, Peter did have a bill of sale, which I would have loved to have gotten a copy of to add to my provenance. But Peter, living in California, lost his house in a mudslide, and he lost that bill of sale. I contacted 20th Century Fox, and of course they ignored me. Does that answer your question? Anyone else? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your interest. Enjoy your evening.